Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we're good to go? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this session. My name's Stephen O'Donoghue. I'm a sales engineer at Cloudera. I've been at Cloudera for about a year and been active in the industry for many years beyond that. And today I'm joined by Alison as well, who's going to be co-presenting with me.
Hi, I'm Alison now. I'm Director at Test, Learn, Iterate, where I provide data analytics strategy consulting. And prior to that, I was the Managing Director of Cox Automotive Data Solutions, where I worked quite closely with the team at Cloudera.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Alison. So this afternoon, we're going to be talking to you about workloads on premises, in the cloud, about governance, about security, and around some of the challenges that customers face when they are adopting different types of workloads depending on where it is what they want to deploy their analytics. Now, I'm pretty sure most folks in the room will be familiar with Cloudera. One of the things that I think about when I think about what Cloudera does and what it means is that we provide a modern platform. So we provide a modern end-to-end platform that allows you to do all the things that you need to do to bring data into the platform, to analyze it, to transform it, and to do those data science capabilities on top of that architecture. And with it being Cloudera, we are based on an open source core. So when we talk about the modern platform for machine learning analytics, that modern story is based on contributions to the open source community, the latest innovations, and what we can bring to our customers. And the technology that we provide, we're able to deploy that architecture on premises and in the cloud, and not just in one cloud, but in all of the cloud providers. And we have multiple paradigms on how we do that, and that's some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to go and explore this third concept here around the shared data experience. But to get it going, I want to introduce some concepts here and think about maybe some of the legacy approaches that all of us will have had to have dealt with at some point in our careers. So when we're building an architecture out, obviously we have data within the platform. So we have this storage layer. We also have an application context, so we have a compute layer. But when we're building an architecture, or you're building a project, you've got to think beyond the storage and the application. You've got to think about what's the security model, what's the governance, what's the lineage, what's the audit. And when you're working on a project, you need to bring all these things together. And here I've kind of separated out the tiers in the architecture around storage, the compute, the application layer, and this context layer in here. Many of us come from a world whereby when we've tried to do analytics or machine learning or ETL, we've had to fight the siloed mentality. And every time that you try to tackle a new project or a new workload, you have to think about these three concepts. Now, depending on where you are on your data journey, maybe you've thought about how you consolidate some of these tiers. How do I consolidate the storage? How do I consolidate the context here? And how do I consolidate the compute? And this is where the Cloudera platform comes into play. So the architecture, if you're on premises that we offer, is one whereby you can consolidate your data storage layer onto HDFS, or indeed, some of the other storage layers that we provide within the platform, so things like Kudu or HBase. Within the platform, we provide the capability to do things like data science and data engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So the approach that we offer from an on-premises point of view is to take some of those siloed mechanisms and bring them together within a consolidated platform. And one of the benefits that you get of doing this is around the context. So before, in a siloed world, we had multiple copies of security, governance, audit, et cetera, et cetera. But as we bring our data together, as we bring our workloads together, we're able to consolidate on some of these tiers.
And just alongside with that, I think it's really important, I think, for those that are analysts, data scientists in the room, you know how much time you spend cleansing data. And that's no one's favorite part of the job, typically. And having this sort of model is really important because it means that the same data structures, data models, data definitions are used consistently for multiple different applications. So whether that's doing some R&D if you're a data scientist, or building some reports if you're an analyst, all the way through into production. And so effectively cleanse the data, build the data models once, and then it can be reused by multiple teams, which I think is as when I was at Cox was the biggest benefit that we saw in taking this sort of architectural approach.
Yeah. What happens when you move into the cloud, though? So when you go into the cloud, there are multiple paradigms of moving into the cloud. So are you going to put all of your data into one cloud, into many clouds? Are you going to spin clusters up? Are you going to have one cluster, two clusters, three clusters? The flexibility which the cloud gives you, it's great. It addresses many of the limitations that you have on premises. But when you have that flexibility within the cloud and you're spinning entities up, it's very, very easy to get back into this siloed mentality. So, if you want to run a data engineering workload, okay, great, I'll spin that cluster up. If I want to run a data warehousing workload, great, I'll spin that cluster up. And as you're spinning these entities up, you're introducing additional compute into the platform, and also you have to think about how do you do your security in a cloud-based world? How do you do your governance in a cloud-based world? How do you know if I'm spinning clusters up and down, what actually happened and how that data was transformed and who transformed that data? So the flexibility of the cloud means that you can actually get back into this siloed mentality. And I think that whether you're using a Cloudera approach or you're using a different platform approach, you need to think about where the storage is in my architecture, where the compute is in the architecture, on where the context is going to live. So so here are some of the challenges that I've just kind of called out here. As I go into the cloud, what are the best practices for instantiating clusters? The flexibility may mean I've got lots of clusters, so how do I do that administration? Where does my security layer sit? Does it sit in each cluster? If I do it that way, then it becomes difficult to manage. And things around regulation as well, all the more important in the age that we live in. So just to summarize sort of the three components in the tiers of the architecture here that I think we need to consider, and consider more so in the cloud, we have data. So data is stateful. When you go into the cloud, and I'm personally closer to the AWS terminology, so I'll use that for the purpose of this presentation. So maybe your data is in S3. So your data is in S3, it's going to live there, it's going to stay there. The compute is stateless, or it can be. I can have my data in S3, I can spin up a cluster, I can do some processing, I'm going to spin it down. As I spin it down, I lose the context, I lose the security, I lose the governance. Who did what to my data? Where's the metadata in the architecture?
And I think really importantly, what happened to all those rules, the logic, all of that cleansing that I did, that I used for this piece of analysis that I don't want to have to repeat next week, and spinning something else up again, that context piece is really, really critical. And again, if this isn't managed appropriately, you'll end up duplicating a lot of the work that's one of the most frustrating parts of analysts and data scientists' roles.
So one of the takeaways for this presentation, if I may, is to think about these three things. Think about how you do them on premises, and what architectural approach I'm going to take as I move into the cloud, and I take advantage of that flexibility. So the approach that we have, within Cloudera is a framework that we've introduced, and this framework is called the SDX. It's called the Shared Data Experience. So this is a model which we have introduced to address the challenges that we've just been through. And to get to the nub of how this framework works, what we're actually doing in our cloud-based architecture is we're saying, when we instantiate a context, we're going to persist it. So typically in a cloud-based world, depending on how far you've gone in your cloud journey, you may have persistent clusters, you may have transient clusters. And what the SDX framework allows us to do is use some common services and components within the Cloudera platform. And what we do is we bundle those together and we persist them within the architecture, so that even though you have a dynamic cloud-based environment, you're able to still do things like security and maintain the security layer. You're able to do audit and lineage and governance and some of the things Alison talked about around metadata. We persist that layer in a cloud-based architecture. So at a high level here, when we think about how the Cloudera platform works and what it's offering here, we have different tiers in the storage. So the Cloudera will work on top of S3, it will work on top of ADLS, so it will work on top of the object storage. It'll also work on top of native HDFS and some of the other data layers in the architecture, so things like Kudu that we also offer. We've got this mentality of being able to bring different application workloads into the platform, so whether that be data science or data warehousing, but we also have a common layer. So this common layer that you perhaps had on premises, we're now able to offer in the cloud in a dynamic cloud-based environment. So let's go a little bit into a bit more detail in terms of what you need to think about when you go into the cloud. So there are different paradigms that you can adopt. It's very easy to get going, but what's the right fit for you? What's the right fit for your customer? Are you going to have a persistent cluster? Are you going to reserve some instances and keep that running? Are you going to operate in a more transient model? And Alison's got some feedback on some of the things you need to consider when you're looking at your cloud architecture here.
And I think this is really driven based off of what the business use cases are. So if initially your use cases are doing some data science projects that requires heavy computer, maybe some heavy data engineering processing, and you're just testing things, transient might make sense. If you need to run jobs for streaming analytics to power websites that are running 24/7 with a global consumer base, you probably need something that's persistent, or maybe something that's elastic that then can flex based off of what the demand is over the course of the day during peaks and troughs. But you definitely need to have a core cluster that's always operational, at least with a couple of nodes, because you're running a business that's operating 24/7, or the data needs are 24/7. So I don't think that there's necessarily any one single architecture that's the right one. It will depend on the use case, and that's something that needs to be thought about when you're doing this sort of architectural design.
Yeah. So it's about options. So as you move into the cloud, what is the right fit for you? I mean, a really interesting question is, what cloud provider are you going to use? Are you going to use one? Are you going to use two? Are you going to use three? Are you going to use those providers as an infrastructure as a service model, or are you going to use more sort of platform as a service frameworks? So what's the right fit for your organization based on where you are on your journey? And
I think related to that, you also have to recognize that particularly in some organizations where data might be particularly sensitive, or where the scale is such that there may still be a need to retain some of the data on premises, and to have some sort of a blend of an on-prem stroke cloud strategy. How will that be managed? Those are things that you need to think about, particularly when it comes to that governance and the security and data catalog side of things.
Yeah, so what options are available to you as you move into the cloud, and how do you leverage them as you adopt a cloud strategy? So at Cloudera, I guess a common pattern that we've observed and seen is many people taking what it is they have on premises and basically lifting and shifting that architecture into a cloud provider. And there are pros and cons of doing that. One of the pros might be it's simple to understand because you're basically lifting and shifting what you have already, and you're going to put that in the cloud. So that's a particular paradigm. So over here on the left-hand side of the slide, we basically are offering an on-premises architecture in the cloud. Okay, so you've got all the work to do in terms of how you instantiate and how you manage that cluster. Maybe that's a good first step because you're familiar with how things worked on premises, and you want to see the same sort of dynamics as you move into the cloud, but using cloud infrastructure. But then, on the right-hand side here, we've got dedicated clusters for data engineering and data warehousing. And these are more platform as a service models. So I'm going to spin these up, I'm going to spin them down. They're going to be transient workloads. Maybe I want to use them for development. Maybe different business users are going to use them for different market sectors. So, what you need to think about are, what is my strategy as I go into the cloud or into a multi-cloud architecture, and what tools do I have available? Now, what I'm showing here are the ability to take your on-premises architecture and deploy that into a cloud-based environment and kind of couple that with some of the more platform as a service models. And through the SDX framework, what we're able to do is link these clusters together. As you introduce more and more workloads into your cloud provider, you need to think about, how do I do the security, how do I do the governance, how do I do the audit, and how do I do the lineage? And the way that we link that is through this SDX framework. So I just wanted to go through a couple of paradigms of how we deploy our technology into the cloud. And again, you may have different views on how to do this. It's around kind of articulating some of the options and some of the frameworks that are available. So Cloudera Director is a infrastructure as a service model. So this is a technology that we would use if you wanted to deploy what you had on premises and see a very much an on-premises model deployed into a cloud provider. So you would go through the mechanics of actually installing Cloudera Director, and Director would act as an orchestrator into your chosen cloud provider. So using this approach, you could configure and you could install a full end-to-end Cloudera cluster, but with a few clicks, you could deploy that into Amazon, into Azure, or into Google. And this makes the point here around what we're able to offer here is a multi-cloud architecture. So you are able to operate in one cloud or in many clouds, and adopting very much the same framework that you have from an on-premises point of view. We can couple that with more of a platform as a service model. In the platform as a service model, we have dedicated ways of deploying data engineering or data warehousing workloads. And if you come to the demo booth just outside the theatre here, I and my colleagues can show you how easy it is for this to use. So in this paradigm here, if you wanted to launch a data engineering or a data warehouse workload, there's basically nothing for you to install or configure. There's no cluster management. It's all handled by Cloudera behind the scenes. So just to kind of help me articulate that in a bit more detail, the way that our platform as a service architecture works, as an end user for you, it's all driven through a web browser. So you would log into a web-based console, and when you do that, you log into the Altus control plane, which is hosted by Cloudera. That control plane would be configured to interact with your cloud provider, whether that is AWS or Azure. So again, we have this concept of a multi-cloud architecture, and through a web-based console or using a CLI, you're able to instantiate clusters with a few clicks that are easy to spin up, and they have no management or configuration for you to do. So we couple this flexibility and the ability to do this easily with our infrastructure as a service model, which gives you all the capabilities that Cloudera offers in its technology. Whether you're using infrastructure as a service model, whether you're using that coupled with some of the more platform as a service orientated techniques, the way that we link these together is through the SDX framework. And what actually is it? What are the components in SDX? How do we link these together? So these are actually based on common services or common components that already exists within the Cloudera cluster. So, so Alison was talking about metadata. So metadata is stored in the Hive metastore, and the way that we would persist that metadata and the security and the governance is by spinning up a cluster or managing these entities outside of your traditional compute in the cloud. So if you're in the cloud and you spin up a cluster for some transient workloads and you're using the SDX framework, the SDX framework will actually exist in its own entity outside of your transient workloads. So the SDX model is designed on common services. If you're familiar with the Cloudera, the way we do things like security and governance today, it's all around how we persist those outside of transient and cloud-based approaches to workloads. So when we think about how we go into how we move into the cloud, there are different paradigms that you have to think about. So we've talked about some of these, whether it's persistent, whether it's transient. Am I going to have one cluster? Am I going to have many? One of the challenges that I faced in my career is around how do I do multi-tenancy? That's always been a hard problem to solve for on-premises clusters. If you're moving into the cloud, you might put all of your data into an object store, and then you might have different clusters for different tenants in your organization. So you might have a product cluster, you might have a finance cluster, you might be sharing your data through an object store. And how do I manage security, governance, et cetera, So these are capabilities and different ways of thinking that you didn't have to consider when you adopted an on-premises approach. So, multi-cloud, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and how do we bring all of those components together? And, there are many things to think about here, and everybody will be on a different stage of their data-driven journey. Folks may be doing stuff on premises, they may be going straight into the cloud, but you've got to start at a certain point in that journey, and work that way through. And Alison's got some great experience with taking customers on that approach.
And I think one of the things that's really important about this, when you're thinking about what the cloud strategy is also how much leverage you have with a cloud provider. Because there's 3, basically, cloud providers in the market. And if anyone has worked with a cloud provider and had any negotiations with them around billing, you know how great things are at the start and how there's a tendency to ratchet up those costs. Well, if you are fully integrated with one cloud provider and all of their proprietary tooling and technology, you don't really have a credible threat to leave, because the costs that you would incur for doing so would be quite significant, and the amount of time and effort, etc. By using a provider like Cloudera, and this is one of the things that we saw at Cox, the ability for us to switch cloud providers would be quite easy and straightforward, which helped give us negotiating leverage when it came to pricing. So that's one of the things that for you to think about and what your approach is how fully tied and embedded you are into one particular cloud provider and their technology and approach. Not necessarily because you would want to switch, but how much leverage would you have in negotiating with them? I was with a FTSE 100 CIO last week, and they were switching cloud providers exactly for this sort of reason, because of the price increases that they were seeing with one of their current cloud providers. So this is just one of the things to think about if you're in a leadership position, and what the strategy is. How much are you going all in with one particular provider, and what will that mean next year, the year after, from a budget perspective, as those fees start to increase? And I don't. When I speak with a lot of organizations, that's not something that is necessarily at front of mind. People just get really excited about the benefits that the cloud can offer, which is great when you're setting things up, but you just need to think about what will that be over the next sort of 3 to 5 years. I think as well, as you go along this journey, as I mentioned that some of the metadata management, the more that you can do that in one place that people have access to for different use cases, and I think the previous slide does a good job of illustrating that. For finance to have access to the same data models, same governance, security, etc., security benefits as a sales team, for example, is quite important. And one of the things that we did at Cox as we looked at that metadata management is there are only a couple of people that had the rights to be able to access and update and make changes to that. But everyone in the data team had read visibility into it. so they could understand what the lineage was of data, where did it come from, et cetera, what were the transformations that were made along the way. And again, that enabled us to increase the rate with which we were able to produce analysis and ultimately put things into production, because people didn't have to spend time recreating that themselves, which isn't anyone's favorite part of the job. So again, that's another really important thing to think about. While the needs and applications for data science, data engineering, sales team might be quite different, having all of that metadata stored in some place that is persistent, that will continue on even if clusters spin up and down, is something that needs to be considered.
Okay, great. So I think from my own experience, pretty much all of my customers are using at least 2 cloud providers. So what folks need to think about is, what's the paradigm in terms of how I deploy into them, and what approach am I going to take? Am I going to use native services, or am I going to take and adopt a paradigm that I can use on premises and in, say, AWS and in Azure? And that's really where we step into the fold as an organization to offer a common footprint that you're able to span each of those, but also do it in such a way that the components are integrated. So that's all we wanted to cover in this presentation. We've got a couple of minutes. I don't know if there are any questions that you may want to ask myself or Alison. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks very much for your time.